Without further ado, we're absolutely delighted to have Emil come visit us today. Emil sits over in the Danish Centre for Studies in Research Policy. Emil is working on a project as a postdoctoral researcher now, studying the scientific elites in Denmark. So this is, those who are perhaps contributing, getting a lot of money, publishing in high impact journals and so on, and that is in collaboration with Jens Peter, who is a senior research fellow at the centre as well. Emil did his PhD here and is working on various projects looking at funding mechanisms, how money is distributed in Denmark, how citation practices happen, all kinds of interesting things related to scientists in Denmark. And I'm really, really delighted that he could come over and tell us about this seed-funded project that we received some funding for last year. And the project, like many, has taken a little bit longer to get through than we initially anticipated, but that's also because of the richness of the data available. So thank you so much, Emil, for coming over,
Sure.
and we really look forward to your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, so the title of the project is actually we're known as an expert in research funding COVID-19 in Denmark. Just a short thing about me and the project. So, as Christine said, I used to be a PhD student, newly minted PhD, studying mostly research funding concentration in Denmark and the UK. At the Danish Centre for Studies in Research Policy, and we generally do what some would call science of science, or meta-science, or sociology of science, or there are many sort of names for it, but we study the scientific system and the functioning of the scientific system in general from different angles. So it's a cross-disciplinary center with people from political science, economics, the humanities, history of ideas, anthropology, and a few natural science researchers as well from physics. And me specifically, so in my PhD I studied funding concentration. I have a few leftover examples if you want one.
Can you send it around?
Yeah, I can send them around here if you want. Have more just left on me. And now we focus mostly on this scientific elites project that goes into sort of defining and investigating the scientific elite globally, mostly understood in terms of this concentration patterns. So it's not elites in sort of a normative understanding, but more in sort of a descriptive understanding. Then I also dabble a bit in this gender inequality in science in general, and a bunch of other stuff that we can talk about if we want to. So the project is joint work with Christine, Peter, and Ea a bit. So we are also researchers from very different disciplines. Jens Peter is a former medical librarian turned scientometric researcher, I think. So he counts publications. And Ea does a lot of sort of participant observations. He's I think a sort of business anthropologist. And I'm from political science originally, but I don't do much political science nowadays. Good. So just to sort of set the stage for this project, I want to go into two separate things. So the first is sort of the Danish research funding landscape. So in Denmark, I think it's sort of a special situation. I mean, all countries are special in this way, but it's a very fragmented system for funding research, right? We have a bunch of different public and private funders, a lot of them. There are many sources to get research funding, and it has become an increasingly competitive battle for getting research funding. I think most of you have tried that yourselves, but we also know that the balance between the block funds that universities get and these competitive grants that are sort of the two legs of research funding in Denmark have shifted somewhat during the past 20 years. So we've seen an increasing tendency for more money to be allocated by competitive means, where individual researchers have to apply for grants in some way, instead of funding being allocated in block funds to the university and then distributed in the system. Then another important development has been the size of these research grants. So we've seen a huge development in the size of research grants. Almost all funders have increased the size of the individual grants, but reduced sort of the number of grants they give out. So these are two broad developments that have sort of led to a more, I would say, competitive landscape. We have falling success rates for many areas, somewhat different across different funders, but for example, the Independent Research Foundation's Research Leader Grant, it has a success rate of only 10%. And these are sort of things that are generally accepted across the system, that have these very competitive funding competitions. Right. So, and these are sort of the developments that we have seen across the different sciences. So not only has the amount of funding increased, but the role of organizations and foundations in funding research has increased quite a bit, especially within the health sciences and the natural sciences. So whereas the research councils, the traditional research councils still allocate a lot of money, we have seen a huge influx of money from sort of these big foundations tied to some sort of corporate or non-profit entities. Right. So with this sort of increased competition, we have also seen a great concentration in research funding. So this is the cumulative share of grant recipients and the share of funding from 2004 to 2016 for 14 research funders in Denmark. And what we see is that sort of 25% of all funded researchers have sort of 80% of the total amounts allocated. So it's a fairly concentrated distribution of funding, much more concentrated than any sort of income distribution would be in any country in the world. But it also hides that the concentration is even greater, because we don't know much about the people who apply but don't get funding. So if we try to estimate that, we could give different guesses of how many researchers are active in Denmark in this time period. Just if we take 15,000 researchers as an example, then we get that 25% of researchers also have 90% of the competitive funding allocated. So it's a very concentrated system.
So when is this?
So this is from these are data from 2004 to 2016 that we collected during my PhD. So it's roughly 14,000 research grants awarded in that time period from 12 major funders.
And over that time period, has it changed? I mean, do you have like a temporal window of this?
It has become a bit more concentrated, but it has always been very concentrated.
Okay.
So, but it has become a bit more concentrated. And this is also very evident if we look at the average amount of funding per grantee. So the top 100 grantees, they have almost 95 million individually on average. And the share of women is not very impressive within any of these sort of top funded groups. So the next one is just the next 400 most funded researchers, and we see that the first there's only 16 women within this group, and here we only have 15% as well. So it speaks to a very concentrated system, very skewed system of allocation. And definitely if we compare sort of the gender distribution, for example, in the funding amounts to how many women are actually employed in a research position, right? So the overall spread is sort of 60-40, but looking at the funding amounts, it's more 78% versus 22%. So it speaks to that even though there are actually a lot of women researchers, right, they are not very well represented within sort of the group of people who receive competitive funding. And of course there are some differences looking at sort of the humanities and social sciences versus the natural, technical and health sciences, but the pattern is pretty similar, right, that they're actually, so this is the full-time equivalent, full-time researchers, right? And then looking at the people who are within the grantee group, we see that 34% are women, but women only get 22% of the total funding amounts. Right. So this is basically the first sort of part of setting the stage, right? It's a very concentrated system. Second is, what happened then when COVID-19 hit? Was this a great equalizer or inequality enhancer? So this is taken from a Nature Human Behavior paper where they have asked 7,000 researchers how changes in their work hours have been during COVID. And we see that it's fairly common that people have worked less during COVID than before COVID. I mean, here we're taking for granted that they can actually remember, but what we see is a negative change in total work hours, especially on sort of research and fundraising. So this could potentially lead to maybe a more equitable distribution if everybody is hit equally, but I'm a bit skeptic about that. So looking at my colleagues' paper here in eLife, they show that the proportion of women first authorships on COVID-19 papers are a lot less than expected, right? So it speaks to a situation where the COVID-19 pandemic has hit different researchers differently, right? So that on average, women may have had a reduction in their working time that are bigger than, for example, men on average. This is also what these guys show in this paper here. That if you are a younger researcher and if you are a female researcher, or not male researcher actually, and if you have younger children, then the amount of work that you can put in during COVID has been greatly reduced compared to others. And so has this already sort of impacted publications, right? That first authorships and also last authorships, but mainly first authorships have gone down a bit. Looking at a longer time period, so we tried estimating sort of the gender gap in publication productivity, also how many publications you have published each year, and there's been sort of a consistent gender gap, but this has sort of increased a lot from 2019 to 2020. So we see that men and women's publication trajectories, so this is the average predicted publication counts, have sort of increased in unison, but when we look at the difference between 2019 and 20, we see that women experience a decline that's much greater than men do. So the gender gap has sort of increased during this time. Okay, so these are sort of the two things that I want you to think about in terms of the study, right? You have very concentrated funding, and it seems as COVID have hit especially women and young researchers to a larger degree on their working time and their productivity, publication productivity. Don't know anything about teaching, we don't know anything about anything else, but publication productivity. Okay, so taking this as a starting point, this study, we tried to ask who applied and received research funding during these COVID-19 restrictions in Denmark, and how application success rates different across men and women, early career researchers, later career researchers, and compared to sort of regularly non-COVID focused funding calls. So we are looking at both funding that is specifically for COVID-19 research and funding that's not, but just given in the same time period. And then we want to compare these to these historical data patterns that I showed before, right? From the 2004 to 2016. So you might say that we want to create sort of a descriptive overview of like these allocated patterns, give some knowledge about funding outcomes for those who were successful, but also hopefully, if possible, for those who were not successful. And then do some comparisons both between COVID-related funding and non-COVID related funding, and these present data and the past data. Yeah. So we have these existing data that was collected before, but we are trying to collect new data on COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 related research. Good. So this approach sort of goes, we go through some different steps, right? So try to identify some major research funders via this research professional website. Identified at least 23 research funders. So these are foundations, companies, public entities. And then we do three different things, right? We web scrape all their publicly available funding. So many have websites where they publish who were funded. So we web scrape that, and also to try and get the emails of the individual principal investigators, and then send out a survey to these principal investigators to get some additional information about them, so that some demographic data, how much research time they've had, etc. But there's also a different line of inquiry where we contact each of these research funders to ask them for, could we get an overview of your funded and unfunded projects? If not, could we get some success rates broken down by sort of career stage, gender, etc. So this is necessary because there's no real central overview of funding outcomes in Denmark at all. I mean, we have such a fragmented landscape that nobody really knows what the other one's doing. So that's why we had to do this, and it's a lot of time-consuming work. That's why this is a very preliminary so far. So these are sort of the breakdown of some of the funders that we have web scrape data for. So you would recognize some of the biggest public and private funders. We have the minorities, we have Lundbeck, Independent Research Foundation Denmark, etc. So this is just a breakdown. Some of them had COVID-related research grants, some didn't. Yeah. So now I think we come to the main dish. We'll try to say something preliminary about what we found. So if we look at gender differences, we can look at both gender differences in terms of the number of grants, but also the grant amounts, right? So there are some unknown persons. We don't know anything sort of demographic about them. Some don't identify as either men or women, and we tried breaking it down here. So what we see if we look at the grant amounts, right? 68% of all funding during this period went to a PI identifies as a man. 31.7% to a PI who identifies as a woman, and I think 0 point something to someone who identifies differently, something other than man or woman. But we also have sort of 500 grants or so where we have really no information about these persons. Hopefully that will be taken care of maybe with the survey, but let's see. It's a lot of grants, but not a lot of funding in total. These are mostly from smaller research funders. If we break it down on sort of COVID-related versus not COVID-related research, we see, lo and behold, that this already very skewed distribution of funding is even more skewed for the COVID-related research. So it seems as though for COVID-related research, women only attain sort of 23.2% of the total funding amounts, or roughly 30% of the grants. And this is, I think, not too surprising because a lot of these COVID-related grants were very big. So it's a lot of money. So Carlsberg Foundation, they gave out a number of grants, sort of 25 million Danish crowns, right? It's sort of a lot of funding centered on one project. So it's very skewed in that sense. Same goes for sort of career stages, right? So not too surprising, but overall, professors seem to be the most, the best at, or the luckiest, I don't know. But they receive the most funding of all, 30% of all grants that year, but 56% of all funding. So they also get the major grants, right? The big ones. And then the associate professors are very successful as well. Postdocs, assistant professors, not so much. PhD students, not at all, almost. Some management, some deans and some pro-deans were also a bit successful, right? But it's the hierarchy, the academic hierarchy is sort of retold here through grants, and it's mostly reproducing what you would think.
So what is this unknown that gets 25%?
Yeah. So these are the same unknowns here. So people that we don't really have that much information about, which hopefully the survey will remedy. But let's see, it's mostly smaller grants from research funders that don't have that much public information on who received the grant. So maybe we gave out this grant, or we gave out this many grants and with this amount of funding, but they have no real information about who the recipient was. Or maybe they just have like one name and it's a medical doctor that's hard to find or something. But again, it's 25.9% of all the grants, but it's not a lot of the total funding amounts, so it's not very big grants. It's smaller grants from the regions, etc. Again, breaking this down across sort of COVID-related or not COVID-related, we see an even starker concentration again. So the professors were the absolutely most successful in receiving COVID-related funding, which was exactly as we expected, I think. I mean, these COVID-related grants have a fast turnover, so most only had 1 or 2 weeks to sort of prepare an application, and we could argue that the professors are maybe also the most, I don't know if they're the most skilled, but maybe they're the most trained in sort of applying for funding and fastly coming up with an idea. And looking at sort of the intersection of these two sort of demographic groups, right, it's some interesting things come up, I think. So looking at the professors, we see that a huge amount of or a huge piece of the professors were men naturally, because this is how the sort of the scissor diagram works in Denmark, right? the women outnumber the men on these sort of younger positions, but as soon as we hit sort of this associate professor position or professor position, it sort of reverses. And we see the same in these funding data, right? That amongst the professors who got COVID-related funding, only 24% were women. For associate professors, this was only 19%, which differs somewhat from the non-COVID-related funding. So it's an even starker concentration among the COVID-related funding. Any questions about this? So, in total, what can we say? Oh, well, it seems as though that an already very concentrated system has just become even more concentrated during this COVID pandemic this year. So it has really not sort of equalized, but more enhanced an already very skewed system. And just looking at the concentration in individuals as well shows sort of the same thing, right? That 25% of the PIs have somewhere between 60 to 74% of all the funding this year. Because I haven't calculated the Gini coefficient, but it's much bigger than South Africa, for example, which is sort of a very unequal democracy. Yeah. This is a line of equality, right? So if everybody had the same amounts, we would see it following this line, but it's evidently not the case. Yeah. So, yeah.
I was just thinking about this question of whether it is caused by COVID-19. So you say that that the pandemic has had this effect. It has made it more concentrated.
Mm-hmm.
But I was wondering how much we can say about that with this data, because the data is about the funds that are thematic for COVID-19 research, right?
Yeah.
But not a time stamped. It's not like a contrast between pre and post.
That's true.
Yeah.
We do have data on when the deadline for the grant application was.
Yeah.
And we have pulled data not just from, so there were thematic calls from Lundbeck, for example,
Yeah.
thematic calls from BFF, we pulled everything. So we do have data that will eventually allow us to say a little bit about success rates
Yeah.
pre the March 2020
Yeah.
kind of restriction period and post.
Yeah.
But
So-
it is a bit tricky actually, because a lot of these foundations, they don't necessarily put their deadlines on and they announce who got funding 6 months later or
Mm.
even longer. So it can be a little bit trickier to figure out,
Yeah.
particularly for things like the quick calls that came out when the deadline actually was, how fast, how much time do people have between call announcement and application
Yeah.
deadline. But we do have some of that data at least.
Yeah. Yeah, I find it very, very interesting, and it's not to say that there's no relevant effects here. It's just about the wording of the interpretation.
Yeah.
When we interpret this, it is very much about also how strongly maybe these funding, these grants that were thematic, were perhaps even more, influenced by this skewing, which is also very unfortunate. But
But I mean, also, I mean, the number of grants that were COVID related is not huge as well, right? It's in the hundreds or something. Yeah. So the numbers also a bit more sensitive to changes in these, right?
Mm.
So these are sort of very broad brush strokes across the funding landscape in 2020. And I just wanted to sort of not give too much of an explanation of these patterns. I think that's a bit premature, but to think about what sort of these numbers say about the inequality in the system. So what we could ask ourselves is this a case of sort of bias against certain demographic groups, or is it a case of disparity? So these are sort of different mechanisms in equality, like that bias is some sort of direct discrimination of a person or group of persons, right? We have this taste-based discrimination, right? I don't like you because you're sort of a member of this group, and if I were a funding evaluator, I would say I don't think you could produce a very valid research project because you are so and so. And then there's sort of these statistical discriminations, right? That are postdocs tend to be worse at research. I won't give that much money to them, right? Then another thing is sort of disparities, which are more indirect effects of these demographic groupings. So you could call, some would call them selection effects, right? Maybe postdocs are less likely to participate in funding competitions, so they also pre-select out of the running for funding. Or there could be some indirect differences, which are not sort of a direct effect of their group affinity, but more sort of an intermediate relationship. And then lastly, you could think of inequalities as sort of, it could also be spurious in a way that some demographic grouping affects something which is also affected by something other, which sort of creates a relationship between the group and the amount of funding they get. But more about that.
Alright.
So this is a case, right, of just discrimination, of bias, but also discrimination. So say Q is some sort of quality metric which does not exist, that affects your funding outcome, but so does your gender. In this case, we have some sort of bias, right? There's a gender bias. In this case, we don't have a gender bias. So this could be one interpretation of these differences. It's because there's some sort of bias towards certain genders or certain career stages. Another interpretation could be that there's sort of a disparity, right? So that funding outcomes are influenced by the quality of your proposal, but also certain genders or certain career groups choose certain topics that will make them less likely to receive funding. So the whole sort of idea in my dissertation is that there's a very skewed distribution of funding to topics as well, right? So if you research metabolism, you're much more likely to get funding than if you research chronic pulmonary disease, for example. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Same thing could be the case if your sort of demographic group, your gender affects the network that you have, for example, and that in turns affect whether you participate in funding competitions. So maybe you have a strong network that encourage you to apply for funding, or say if you apply you will have a good chance, we will help you, etc. Right? So these are sort of questions of disparity where your demographic group, your gender, or your career stage, it matters, but it matters in an indirect way. And I think with the data that I present here, we cannot discriminate between the two things. Right? We don't know whether this is a case of bias or disparity, but I think it's a problem nonetheless. I mean, it doesn't matter if it matters, of course, if there's discrimination, but either way, it's still a problem, I would argue, for the funding system in general. But then it could also be a case of inequality. So if your gender affects whether you stay in academia or not, and your network affects whether you stay in academia or not, and the network is the primary thing affecting your funding outcome, then because we select, or because we observe only people who stayed in academia, because we observe only people who applied for funding, we inadvertently create this collider bias where there seems to be a correlation between some gender or career stage grouping and the funding outcome, simply because these instead affect sort of whether you stay in academia or not. Again, the data we have here cannot discriminate between sort of this situation and these situations. So it's a very common problem in most of this science and sociology of science, right? That when we want to say something about gender discrimination, often we can only observe the people who were successful, right? The people who published, the people who actually got an appointment somewhere, the people who got funding. And this is a general problem, I think, that have led to many problematic arguments. For example, this over here, that women are actually more likely to become tenured professors in Germany in psychology and sociology, where the problem is that here we only observe the people that actually stayed in academia, right? The same, there was a very famous, now retracted article in Nature Communications that showed that it was better for women to have male mentors for their publication productivity. But again, we only observe people who actually published, not the people who fell out of academia or chose to leave academia. So it's a real problem here, and I think something to think about when interpreting this data. And it's especially a thing to think about because the solutions, I think, to these, the skewness depends on what the mechanism is. So if we have an actual bias situation, then maybe some of these proposed new types of funding mechanisms would work very well. Blinded grant reviews, the Willem Foundation is working, for example, with blinded grant reviews where both the reviewer of the grant and the applicant cannot see anything about the person who applies, not any CV information or etc. So this is a situation where you could sever sort of the arrow going from gender to funding outcome. Same with these modified lottery that everybody sort of get graded in some way on their research proposal, and then we take the top third of those proposals and then we draw a random sample who should then have funding. This could also sever this bias perhaps in some way, but the problem is that if we have some sort of disparity instead where the differences are sort of due to some intermediate or structural differences between groups, then I think this will not work very well, right? So if we have a situation where women are not encouraged to apply in the same way, or their network doesn't help them in the same way, then their participation in grant competitions will maybe be smaller than other groups, and that cannot be fixed sort of with just doing something about the review process. There you have to sort of think about some structural interventions, right, to increase their likelihood of applying in the first place, or some new funding instruments where they perhaps are encouraged more. So we have the Inge Lehmann project, or the Inge Lehmann funding instrument where women are encouraged to apply, right? Or perhaps, especially in the Danish system where we have very few opportunities of postdoc funding for sort of junior researchers, right? Unless you want to go on some mobility grant. Maybe having some more instruments that are sort of only focused towards younger researchers, right, where they don't have to compete with the professors who have 20 years of experience in writing grant proposals. Yeah.
So in your disparity figure there, you
Mhm.
mentioned the choice of topic.
Yeah.
For example, if you had new funding instruments that targeted understudied topics, for example, would that be?
That could be one thing.
Might you get similar effects if you did a lottery system, because that would randomize the topics that could be selected as well? I wonder about differentiation.
If you did a complete lottery, let's say everybody participates in some way,
Yeah.
and then you do a complete lottery, I think that would work. But not many funders have actually bought in on this idea.
In the full, yeah.
So many of them have bought in on the idea of a modified lottery, where you do some sort of pre-selection of applications, right? You say, okay, we have, these are sort of the best, and we take the top third of the applications, or the top fourth of the applications, or somewhere.
You might already be selecting by
And
topic
then,
there.
and then you might already have a sort of selection problem, right? That
Yeah.
maybe some topics are selected out of that. They're not rated as great because they are about, I don't know, pulmonary disease or different diseases that are not hot topics, or different topics that are not that hot in the eyes of the reviewer. So as soon as there's some sort of selection, pre-selection, right, we end up in a situation where this might still happen, or this might still happen.
If you're a funding agency, could you make the argument that it is good to have a lot of people working on the same topic within a small country because you get excellence? Or you talk about concentration. Is there any evidence on whether that brings more positive publication outputs or outputs in general, or is it a good idea that we have concentration? Does that make us better?
Could you repeat it for the camera?
Yeah. The question is concentration perhaps a good thing? Could it be that if you concentrate funds in a small country on a few topics, a few researchers, you also get sort of these hubs of strong research performance?
Yes.
And yes, absolutely, that could be the case. It could be the case in the sense that you get some few selected centers of excellence within certain areas with certain researchers, right, that become world class. And that has been sort of the argument for doing this, for reducing the number of grants and increasing the grant amounts, right?
Yes.
That's been the dominant argument for doing that. But I would argue you also have some inadvertently negative consequences of that, which is, one, how can you foster a great center of excellence in a new area if you don't give any funding to that new area? And I think most researchers, sort of science researchers, sociologists of science, would argue that traditionally we have been very bad at predicting what the next hot or important topic would be. Yeah. So I would argue that it might be the case that it's good to concentrate some funding, but you also lose sort of the growth layer in a bit. So you need sort of a base for a growth layer, and then maybe you can select out some. You need to have a good mix, I think, of concentration and dispersal. Second question was, does concentration have negative effects also? I think it does, but it's a bit hard to measure. So there are some very good papers out there that show that there's a decreasing marginal return to funding in terms of citations and publications, right? So you get more citations and publications as funding increases, but at some point there's sort of a turning point where you don't get much more for your next dollar of funding, or next Danish crown of funding, right? So there's a point where it doesn't matter much. I can't remember. It differs from of course from place to place, right? But there's a good Canadian study that shows that that's about sort of 10 million or something. But I would take that as a bit skeptical, right? Also, we don't know, like, publications and citations are, of course, important metrics in this world of science, but they're also not the only metric, right? So, at least not for all researchers. So I think there's a decreasing marginal return to concentration, which I think argues that for the case that there should be some sort of concentration, it shouldn't be an equal distribution of funding. But there should also be something for sort of a growth layer, or for the sort of the not excellent research. I mean, which could become the excellent research. Yeah. So, any more questions?